O FMS, no coração da América do Sul e do Brasil. A melhor e maior universidade de Mato Grosso do Sul e uma das melhores do mundo, inserida geograficamente nos principais biomas do planeta: Pantanal, Cerrado, Mata Atlântica. Referência no ensino, pesquisa, extensão, empreendedorismo e inovação. Presente em todas as regiões estratégicas do estado, a UFMS possui campus, polos de educação à distância, 2 bases de estudo e fazenda escola. Uma universidade pública gratuita, inclusiva e de qualidade, com produção científica de destaque nacional e internacional. Nosso compromisso extrapola nossas fronteiras e fortalece a sociedade com projetos de extensão, internacionalização, cultura, esporte e saúde. Formamos profissionais engajados com a transformação do país, com foco no crescimento sustentável e humanizado. Trilhamos caminhos com base em gestão estratégica. Vivemos uma transformação digital diária em meio a ações de sustentabilidade, projetos de pesquisa e inovação em bioeconomia, alinhados aos 17 Objetivos de Desenvolvimento Sustentável da Agenda 2030 da ONU, diminuindo distâncias, promovendo a troca de conhecimentos e ampliando a conectividade com Mato Grosso do Sul, Brasil e o mundo. Honramos nossa trajetória desde 1962 e com a federalização em 1979. Olhamos para o futuro com dedicação, amor e esperança. UFMS, a nossa universidade, patrimônio de Mato Grosso do Sul e do Brasil.
Eu sou o UFMS.
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 E eu sei que você também é.
Bom pomeriggio, Itália. Bem-vindos a todos e a todas. Sou o professor Jérri Roberto Marin, da Universidade Federal de Mato Grosso do Sul. Estamos transmitindo diretamente da cidade de Campo Grande, no estado de Mato Grosso do Sul, que faz fronteira internacional com o Paraguai e a Bolívia. É importante ressaltar que em Mato Grosso do Sul estão situados os campi da Universidade Federal. Para garantir o sucesso dessa transmissão, contamos com o apoio da equipe liderada pelo Wellington Indino, da Pró-Reitoria de Extensão, Cultura e Esporte, além das intérpretes Ana e Elizabeth. O tema da mesa redonda é o reconhecimento internacional da independência do Brasil pela Santa Sé. O professor Andrea Carteny, da Universidade degli Studi de Roma, la Sapienza, vai discorrer sobre as relações internacionais e a política externa da restauração. Na minha fala, abordarei os resultados preliminares da pesquisa que realizei no Arquivo Apostólico Vaticano, no Arquivo Histórico de Propaganda Fide, Arquivo della Congregazione degli Affari Ecclesiastici Straordinari e no Arquivo Histórico do Itamaraty, sobre o reconhecimento internacional da independência e do Império do Brasil, com ênfase na política externa da Santa Sé durante o pontificado de Leão XII. Andrea, é uma grande honra para a Universidade Federal de Mato Grosso do Sul contar com sua participação no Simpósio Internacional Independências do Brasil. Bem-vindo, e estamos ansiosos para ouvi-lo.
Thank you, Jérri. I'm very proud. I'm very happy
Obrigado, Jérri. Estou muito feliz e muito orgulhoso
to be here with you in
de
connection
estar
from
aqui com vocês nessa conexão com a Sapienza de Roma, com a Universidade de Mato Grosso do Sul, com você, Jérri.
a lot of interest the research that you carried out in the Archivio Apostolico Vaticano and the Propaganda Fide documents and files, very interesting and unedited. So this is a big honor and interest to hear you, for the audience and for me too. So I'm going to outlook this so-called Vienna system. So as an international history scholar, we have one suffered at Waterloo. Napoleon saw his empire collapse. And that is in the autumn of 1814. The meeting of the International Congress that would decide the fate of Europe began in Vienna, on the throne of France, whose borders were restored to the pre-revolutionary ones. The legitimate heir of the Bourbon dynasty, Louis XVIII, younger brother of Louis XVI, was restored. Even the Napoleonic Kingdom of Italy has seen its end. The Pope, Pius VII, the King of Sardinia, and returned to the possession of the heir state. Previous was troubled on whose throne Joachim Murat remained, with the Bourbons not being restored until 1816. The work of the Congress was masterfully directed by the Austrian Minister of State, Clemens von Metternich, with the important support of the diplomat and French Minister Charles Maurice de Talleyrand. And the principles on which the restoration of post-Napoleonic Europe was based were essentially two: the so-called the principle of legitimacy, power as a supreme value, since it divine right. It therefore provided for the restoration to their legitimate throne of the European sovereign who had been arbitrarily deposed by force during the French Revolution and under the rule of Napoleon. From this legitimist perspective, divine right once again assumed, after the revolutionary interlude, a significant political role, attempting to restore that combination of throne and altar, which had governed the fate of Europe for so long, and the principle of balance, according to which no European power should aspire to or achieve hegemony. To resolve these serious issues that would inevitably arise and guarantee this balance of power, the powers under convened large international congresses on the Viennese concert. An international would last until the break of the Great War in 1914. Most important aftermath. The relationship between church and the state, a country that no longer has an official religion, has happened, which neither intend to modify the spirit cuius recet et eius religio, introduced in the middle of the 16th century. allows it to operate, even military, to obtain an overthrow by acting of the prince, that it needs to find the particular statute for the most important religion power existing in French society. For example, with the Congress of Vienna at the age of the Restoration, the Catholic Church seeks to return to the status quo ante and commits itself to it with all it can realize it's with the principles that regain possession of their lands and that should restore the order of the ancien regime. But not everything was before. On the contrary, it is precisely the effects of the revolutionary and concordat system. Church must adapt to the idea that those who find by the expropriation of the ecclesiastical assets intend to use it to the advantage of the state. The Napoleonic, the Concordat system in 1805, when the principle of the separation of the state from and also that during the 19th century, strategies bring the advantages to the initiative of Catholicism towards the state. Tendencies of some churches with national, so-called national claim, Anglicanism, Febronianism, but even in the do not go back to the wall. Example of this duplicity is the restorative concordat of the Bourbons in Italy in 1818, accepting the principle that Catholicism is the only state religion. Equally important, the restoration the Concordat a few decades after with the Austrian Empire, which abolishes a whole series of restrictions introduced in the 18th century by the ecclesiastical second, and makes Catholic doctrine the first component of the Habsburg and state. So let's talk about some alliance as tools of Europe. Instrument of the European restoration were this French perspective, but also against possible revolutionary resurgences. First of these, so-called Holy Alliance, was signed in Paris, September 1815, between Austrian Empire, Kingdom of Prussia, and Russian Empire. These three monarchs, the Habsburg, the Protestant leaders committed themselves to handle European politics according to the criteria of divine right and counter all secularization forms, not only of the revolutionaries, but also of the liberals. A reason that pushed Great Britain to keep out of such a pact. In 1949, it was precisely in the name of the principle of legitimacy which had risen against suppressing the revolution in the republic. The principle of legitimacy at the base of the Holy Alliance proved to be superior in this case even to sovereign itself and the right of non-intervention in the affair of a state, the case of a revolution, and the concept of legitimism, anti-liberalism, thus inextricably linked. A fuse was born, formed by Austria-Prussia, Russia, and Great Britain. Powers involved in the agreement established that would meet regularly to find consensus on issues relating to peacekeeping to with the French expedition aimed to the Spanish throne with the suppression of the so-called effectively sanctioned and the birth of so-called quintuple alliance, which was, however, destined to be short-lived because in France there will be a new liberal revolution in 1830. So let's talk about and the restoration of the Jesuits during 19th century. Therefore, African Asia manifested itself through strategies of ranging
Andrea, you're frozen. I guess you lost connection, Andrea. We cannot hear you.
Bom, eu vou retomar minha fala, então.
Well, I'm going to go back to my speech because of the technical problems with Andrea. The theme of my presentation is the diplomatic negotiations between the Holy See and Brazil for the recognition of independence and the empire, a subject little explored by the Brazilian historiography, whose analyses are centered on the courts of Lisbon, London, Paris, and Vienna, as well as on the United States. In addition, I seek to offer new perspectives for the understanding of the pontificate of Leo XII, which comprised the years of 1823 to 1829, and the administration of Giulio Maria Cavazzi della Somaglia in the Secretariat of State. In general, the historiographical approaches are characterized by the emphasis of aspects of their personalities, often portrayed as methodical, rigid, and inflexible. Many scholars maintain that there have been ruptures both in domestic and foreign policies. Raffaele Colapietra, for example, claimed that between the years of 1823 and 1826, the administration of Leo XII was characterized by a retrogression compared to his predecessor, Pius VII, describing it as lacking in luster and marked by the abandonment of reformist proposals. As of Somalia, dealt with political his performance was mediocre due to his advanced age, personality, education, and political experience that were acquired in a context that had already been overcome. At the international level, the Holy See would have lost the luster of the administration of Ercole Gonçalves, Secretary of State of Pius VII, because Somaglia dealt with political and diplomatic issues with empiricism and excessive formalism, which led him to an ordinary, timid administration without effective coordination. Those characteristics are going to occasion delays on the decision making. Giuseppe Monsagrati considered that the choice of an 84 years old individual for the Secretariat of State was in accordance with the intention of Leo XII to act with the utmost freedom. Paolo Daniele Truscello used the observations of Vincenzo Tisani to illustrate the discrepancies between the personalities of Ercole Gonçalves and Somaglia. Tisani, while acknowledging Somaglia's honestly, highlighted his intellectual and administrative limitations, describing him as formalistic and meticulous. This was manifested, for example, by observing during meals whether the glasses, bowls, and cutlery were properly arranged and whether they followed geometric proportions. In most analyses, the Roman Curia is portrayed in a dichotomous way, as divided between two opposing factions. On one hand, there were the politicanti, a minority that advocated the continuation of the church's policy of partial openness to the transformations underway in Europe, as long as it did not compromise the faith. On the other hand, there were the zelanti, a majority group linked to the old forms and privileges opposed to the administrative centralization proposed by the consalvi and reluctant to accept social transformations. Leo XII is linked to the project of Zelantes, suggesting the renunciation of the reforms and policies implemented by Consalvi. As Roger Albert pointed out, the division in the Roman Curia was not merely political, and positions were not automatic. For while some cardinals fought liberalism and constitutionalism, others preferred to tolerate them if it was advantageous to the Catholic Church. Caretakers and politicians preferred absolutism to constitutional or republican regimes in addition to upholding the principle of legitimacy. Recent research highlights the gaps in studies of pontificate of Leo XII. According to Francois Jancoviac, scholars tend to be more polemicists than critics, emphasizing the importance of transcending analysis restricted to a single pontificate. He argues that it is crucial to examine continuities and changes throughout different pontifical administrations. In examining the political and religious aspects of the pontificate of Leo XII, he observed that there were elements of governmental modernity, and this would be indicative of a continuity rather than a rupture between Pius VII and Leo XII. According to Roberto Regoli, Leo XII sought to satisfy the reformist expectations of his time, promoting changes, especially of a legal administrative nature. His pontificate was characterized by dynamism, effervescence of ideas, projects, and reforms. The 49 cardinals who participated in the conclave to elect the successor of Pius VII were looking for a worthy successor with a moderate pontifical profile, prudent and sensitive to the demands of the contemporary world. In addition, they were looking for someone who would keep the system of government and ecclesiastical policy established by Cardinal Consalvi. As none of the candidates obtained the majority, 34 votes of the Sacred College converged on the Annibale della Genga, who was elected Pope and adopted the name Leo XII. In 28 September 1823, Giulio Maria Cavazzi della Somaglia was appointed to the Secretariat of State, the government body closest to the Pope and responsible for political and diplomatic activities. He was a dean of cardinals and possessed extensive training in administrative, diplomatic, and political matters while holding numerous positions in the Roman Curia. Somaglia possessed a deep understanding of international political issues and was familiar with the foreign and diplomatic policy of the Holy See. As Secretary of State, despite differences in style and experience, he continued Consalvi's policies. In the political sphere, he was willing to compromise. In addition, he had affinities with the cardinals appointed by Pius VII. The independence movements in America have brought new political challenges to international geopoliticals. The member countries of the Holy Alliance upheld the right of Spain and then Portugal to regain control over their former colonies. The impacts of these transformations did not go unnoticed by the Holy See, which positioned itself in favor of the rights of the kings of Spain and Portugal, whose alliances referred to the Crusades and royal patronage. In December 1823, Leo XII summoned Consalvi to an audience in order to analyze the most serious and immediate problems of the Catholic Church. Among the six topics discussed, the one that addressed the independence of the Americas, especially of the Hispanic American countries, received prolonged attention during the debate. The purpose of the meeting was to guide foreign and diplomatic policy to avoid internal damage and attrition with the Roman Curia, and in the geopolitical sphere to align it with the political decisions of the Catholic powers. Consalvi, in analyzing the international situation, advised against the recognition of the independence of the Spanish American countries by the Holy See, although he admitted that Ferdinand Septimus no longer exercised any authority over his former colonies and would hardly be able to regain his sovereignty. He believed that independences had a great chance of consolidating and that soon their governments would gain international recognition and the Holy See would do the same. However, it was crucial that to preserve the principle of legitimacy and to wait for the recognition of independence and governments by Portugal, Spain, and other European Catholic powers. Consalvi suggested that Leo XII maintained the policy of neutrality in the face of European and international affairs and establish harmonious relations with the governments of America and with the Portuguese and Spanish courts. This pendulum policy, alternating between liberalism and absolutism, was intended to avoid any form of opposition to the Holy See. Consalvio argued that any government regimes except anti-religious ones, were compatible with Catholicism and could be recognized as legitimate, thus allowing the Holy See to establish political relations. This flexibility allowed for the adaptation of new circumstances, disruptions, and challenges rather than adhering to rigid precepts. Consalvi espoused characteristically liberal principles. The Holy See should separate political and religious affairs in order to preserve the pastoral mission of the Church and the authority of the pontiff over the local churches. In this case, the recognition of independence of a country or a new government should be a political concern, meaning that Gonçalves was promoting the process of secularization of society.
Conselhos e durante o seu pontificado buscou equilibrar as
Leo
relações.
accepted the consequences and accepted to relate the diplomacy with the other powers, aiming at preserving authority and integrity of the Catholic Church, especially in the political international geocontext that is constantly mutable. Brazil independence in 1822 modified the circumstances of the political relations with Portugal and the same thing. Dom Pedro I, as a governor of a Catholic nation, considered the relation of Brazil and Holy See, which was considered one of the main courts of Europe, of supreme and particular interest in the ecclesiastic part. To this end, 5 months after the Constitution of 1824, he instituted a diplomatic mission with powers to negotiate the recognition of the independence of the Empire of Brazil and the ruling dynasty to regularize ecclesiastic affairs and everything that was convenient to the interests of the church, as treaties, conventions, and concordats. Father Francisco Correia Vidigal was appointed by Imperial Decree of August 7, 1824, to the position of Envoy Extraordinary and Minister Plenipotentiary of Brazil to the Holy See. Father Vicente Antônio da Costa was appointed as Secretary. Leon XII and Somalia were informed about the main happenings in Brazil and Portugal, and followed with interest all the news, both political and religious news. The informants were the representatives from Portugal, France, and Spain. They were keen observers of the political and ecclesiastic situation in the countries with their functions, and by knowing the news and the changes in the politicals, they would immediately inform the Secretary of State. The mail was almost daily or with short intervals. This way, the representatives would play an important role in guiding the strategies and diplomatic and political actions of the Holy See. Other information would come from Brazil, missionaries, bishops, and the higher court of the religious ways would communicate the lack of organization in the Catholic Church. José Caetano Coutinho, the Bishop of Rio, in September 6, 1824, would talk to Leon XII to communicate the imminent travel of Vidigal to Rome. And he also reported that there was the Archbishop in Bahia. Out of the 9 ecclesiastic circumscriptions, only 3 were provided, but these bishops were sick, and the youngest one would be 60, and one of them was blind. The secretary of the Congregation for the Extraordinary Affairs, Giuseppe Sala, was shocked with the religious scenario in Brazil, describing it as crazy. Leon XII, knowing the situation in Brazil and Portugal, recommended extreme moderation on dealing with the topic, and he decided the issue should be sent to the Father Defiti, and in a response of the letter, it would be in general terms, with a complete absence of the issues and religious discussions. Regarding Vidigal, on the 12th of Somali, they adopted the same strategy of Pio VII and Gonçalves would have used regarding José Inácio Puegos from the Chilean government that was sent in July 19, 1822. These institutions became rules to be applied to all the representatives of governments in America. Somali in France decided to be strict and direct while communicating that due to the lack of acknowledgement by the European sovereignty, he wouldn't be received as diplomat. However, the Pope would be willing to hear the spiritual needs of the people. To avoid diplomatic conflicts in the passport, there should be the qualification of traveler instead of business affairs. While receiving the diplomats of America, there was the establishment of the separation between the political and religious aspects. Therefore, they could conciliate the duties as leader and father of all the Catholics and respect to the rights of the Catholics from Portugal and Spain. The diplomatic mission trip to Italy began in the beginning of October 1824, and Vidigal and Costa arrived in Great Britain on November 10th. Giacomo Filippo Franzoni, Consul to Portugal, was informed of Vidigal's presence in London by Pedro Sousa Honstein, Minister of Foreign Affairs, on December 8, 1824. Honstein warned the nuncio that he would send a warning to the Pope that they would not be admitted to deal with political and ecclesiastical matters. The news was promptly relayed by Franzoni to Somalia and Maki. In this context, Franzoni also passed on positive news about the progress of the negotiations between Portugal and Brazil, including the English mediation that would facilitate the conciliation process, which was unavoidable and wouldn't take long to happen. On November 29, Vidigal was in Paris and accompanied by Domingos Borges de Barros, a Brazilian diplomat at the court of Charles X, and he met with the Apostolic Nuncio, Maki, after revealing the conditions for the issuance of the passport, and he warned Vidigal that in Rome, he should not demonstrate that the goals of the trip were political. Also, he was informed that the pontiff would only recognize the independence of the empire or comply with other requests after the recognition of Brazil's independence by Portugal. In the view of the above, Vidigal and Barros tried to call his attention, claiming the needs of the Catholic Church in Brazil, which the pontiff could not omit. Maki remained steady in his arguments, forcing Vidigal to accept the conditions imposed. After that, Vidigal and Costa traveled to Rome, where they arrived on January 5th, 1825. In this conflict, Somalia had already outlined the strategies to receive them. To avoid the occurrence of diplomatic incidents with Portugal and with the Catholic powers of Europe, he kept the strategy of not getting into direct negotiations with Vidigal, nor allowing any personal contact between him and the Pope. He also avoided issuing written documents that could be interpreted as favoring one of the parties to the dispute or as an international recognition by the Holy See, even if indirectly. All communications were transmitted verbally by a trusted member of the Secretary of State staff. Somalia took all the necessary steps to ensure Portugal's ambassador to the Holy See, Domingos Antônio de Souza Coutinho, was unaware of the meeting. In the meetings with Costa and later with Vidigal, Somalia emphasized that the Pope could not create incidents with Portugal and the Catholic powers that would result in the interruption of the political and diplomatic relations with the Holy See. Therefore, he could not accept Vidigal's credentials before Portugal recognized independence. However, he assured that the pontiff would listen and deal with the business in the Church of Brazil. Therefore, he was expressing confidentially the support to the Brazilian cause. Lastly, Somalia recommended that during their stay in Rome, they would be discreet and do not wear badges with the national colors, so as to not show that they were in charge of a public mission. If they were asked about what brought them to Rome, they should answer business and of religion to Brazil. Somalia's warning had positive effects, as Vidigal and Costa were discreet in their public appearances so as not to denounce the goals of the trip to Rome. Somalia revealed to Franzoni that he didn't have, so far, any complaints of them. To avoid diplomatic conflicts with Portugal, Somalia was fast in informing the Portuguese government of the decisions taken by the Holy See. He assured that here nothing will be done to give reason to the objections of His Most Faithful Majesty, whose religion and attachment to the Holy See deserve all respect. Dom João VI, in turn, was happy to learn that the Pope had taken the wise step of not recognizing Vidigal as a representative of a government that claims to be independent, separating itself from the legitimate sovereignty. As a result, the bilateral relations were preserved. The political strategy was to keep neutrality in geopolitical matters and cultivate good relations with both governments, as Brazil's independence could be recognized by Portugal and European powers in the future. The political approaches were not deprived from political calculations, balancing institutional interests with bilateral relations. The external policy of the Holy See towards Brazil followed a different guidance adopted by the Latin American countries. It is due to the acceptance of the arguments presented by the government of Rio de Janeiro in the Manifesto to the Peoples of this Kingdom in August 1st, 1822, and in the Manifesto to the Governments and Friendly Nations on August 6th, addressed to the governments of other countries, especially the European ones. These documents of diplomatic nature were spread in Europe to obtain the support to support the Brazilian independence. Dom Pedro was presented as Brazil and Portugal's savior, as he intended to remove Dom João VI from this state that the Portuguese court reduced him, constituting a threat to the existence of the Bragança dynasty. It also spread the image of Dom Pedro as the architect of an independent and constitutional monarchy and the shield against republican, demagogic, and democratic doctrines. Other diplomatic arguments were that Dom João VI, before returning to Portugal in 1821, sought to stop the monstrous revolution by reinforcing Dom Pedro's authority, investing him with broad powers, even the one of declaring war and peace in order to safeguard the dynastic legitimacy. Dom João VI would give a paternal advice by saying, Pedro, if Brazil separates, it will be better for you, who will respect me, and it's better than for some adventure. As a result, his actions would be anti-revolutionary and legitimist, as he did not rebel against the father and king of Portugal, but against the policies of the courts of Lisbon. In the negotiations between Portugal and Brazil, both the British diplomacy and the Brazilian government would defend that independence was not associated to the liberal revolution. The Portuguese government, however, supported that the independence was of a revolutionary character, despite the arguments and counter arguments. Leo XII and Somalia understood that the actions of Dom Pedro I were against revolutionary and legitimism. The disputes between Portugal and Brazil were less of a revolution. That is, it was not a political revolt, but a family conflict. Another distinction would be the dynastic legitimacy, as Dom Pedro I was the successor of Dom João VI. In addition, it was suspected that the independence was being agreed between father and son, with Dom João VI the mentor. This is because he delegated broad powers to his son, advising him to take the throne before someone take it. Somalia assumed that the independence had the support of the Austrian court. The sympathy of Emperor Franz Joseph I to the Brazilian cause was evident in the mediation of reconciliation between Brazil and Portugal in competition with England, as well as in the lack of prevention to the presence and activities of Vidigal and Costa. The support of Dom Pedro's father-in-law was seen as beneficial, as it could mobilize the support of the European courts for the international acceptance of Brazil. Austria was among the Catholic powers of Europe, and its foreign policy would be the basis and starting point for directing the foreign policy of the Holy See by adopting its positions as a guide. Therefore, the support to the Brazilian cause was relevant in the political European scenario. For Somalia, the strategies and positions adopted by the Holy See were categorized as high diplomacy. That was based on the premise that the pontiff should not transgress international political conventions, thus avoiding the generation of diplomatic incidents with Portugal and other European powers, and of being accused of supporting rebellions against legitimate sovereignties. Therefore, it was imperative for the pontiff not to preempt Dom João VI in order to safeguard political neutrality and the principle of legitimacy in the foreign policy. This international policy was adequate with the decisions of the Congress of Vienna and the Holy Alliance, that is, the defense of the principles that the European balance, restoration, and dynastic legitimacy were there. However, the Holy See's foreign policy towards America by Gonçalves and Somalia followed resistance in the Roman Curia. Many cardinals would interpret it as a revolution and the government of Dom Pedro as illegitimate, disagreeing with the establishment of any international negotiation, including regarding hearing and dealing with purely religious matters with Vidigal. The opposition would follow the Pope not to deal with that and complain the policies adopted by Somalia, thus mining its authority by questioning its competence. Facing that, Leo XII and Somalia had to deal with the different proposals, interests, and internal divisions of the Roman Curia. Among the political struggles, they did not step back and chose to adopt less incisive and more cautious approaches. As has been discussed, Somalia imposed on Vidigal the condition of mere traveling with no political character. His only mission would be to present the pontiff with the situation of the Catholic Church in Brazil. This conduct would paralyze the political negotiations and generate conflicts between the two parties. Vidigal ensured that his first intention was to leave Rome immediately and wait in another city of Italy for the orders of Dom Pedro, and he would not admit any communication with the Holy See until the authority with which he was invested was recognized. However, he remained in Rome but chose voluntary isolation, leaving the residence only to the masses and to visit friends. Among the friendships he had was Cardinal Bartolomeu Paca, who showed support to the Brazilian cause. The friendly relations of the cardinal with the Brazilian delegation provided access to privileged information. And Paca also played the role of intermediary with the Roman Curia and the pontiff. The Brazilian agents tried to resume the diplomatic colloquies in three occasions when they pressured Somalia for the prompt acknowledgement of independence, as that the mission would strengthen the government of Dom Pedro and consolidated the constitutional monarchy. The first attempt was due to a lack of interpretation of Felisberto communication minister in London on January 14, 1825.
A independência do Brasil. Costa procurou persuadir Somália a seguir o exemplo inglês, ao argumentar.
Costa wanted to pursue the English context while saying that if the Holy See were to go ahead of the other heads of states, in fact, it was the unofficial overtures of the British cabinet. The second situation occurred on June 2nd, 1825, when foreign newspapers newly arrived in Rome erroneously disseminated the information that Portugal had recognized Brazil's independence. On the 8th, Costa tried to persuade Somalia that the Holy See should also recognize independence, citing the pressing needs of the Catholic Church in Brazil. On both occasions, Somalia claimed that it was necessary to wait for the official documents and that he had not received any communication from the Portuguese government. The strategy of the Brazilian agents was to persuade Somalia to act on impulse so that he would remove the barriers to negotiations and recognize the independence and empire of Brazil before Portugal and the European countries. Somalia, on the other hand, pondered of the variables from a political and diplomatic point of view. In addition, he knew how to deal with situations of pressure and or conflict, and in these circumstances followed the typical procedures of the diplomacy of the Holy See. That is, he adopted ambiguous postures that ranged from sobriety to avoid hostilities and direct conflicts, the search for conciliation to maintain a climate of optimism, and a firm and imperious determination to defend the rights and prerogatives of the Holy See. It was foreseen that airy and procrastinating policies would require patience, plasticity, and immense ease from Samaga. In exercising his diplomatic skills, he adopted polite and serene postures and always reaffirmed the pontiff's sympathy for the cause of Brazil to reassure Vidigal and Costa. Such confidences had a certain official character, as they revealed the position of the Secretariat of State and the pontiff on Brazil. The third circumstance occurred on June 25th, 1825, when Costa visited Somaglia claiming to have received new recommendations from the government of Rio de Janeiro. The intention of the visit was to influence Somaglia so that he would anticipate the other nations in the international recognition of independence and in the empire. Somaglia repeated the previous arguments, that is, that it was necessary to have official confirmation from the Portuguese government and that the Austrian government had not yet accepted the credentials of the Brazilian diplomat. Costa, in trying to persuade him, claimed that in order to preserve Catholicism, Dom Pedro would first have to adopt measures without the consent of the Holy See, suggesting the possibility of an ecclesiastical schism, as it was a dissuasive and sensitive argument to the Holy See. Tamaglia, following with the measures to postpone the decisions and seeking to understand more deeply the situation in Brazil, asked Costa to present a memorial where he would detail only religious issues and that justified the Pope's urgent help. To preserve the Holy See, the document had to be signed by Costa and addressed to Abbe Girolamo Galanti, so as to prevent it from assuming an official and political character. This consultative document would be presented to the pontiff for deliberation and strategizing for action. The memorial was presented on July 2nd, 1825, along with two petitions to address the spiritual needs of the Catholic Church in Brazil. In the memorial, Costa evoked images that had political and diplomatic objectives. The document was drafted with the intention of reinforcing the religious disorders that existed in Brazil and that required the urgent interventions of the pontiff, such as the creation of two bishoprics, the appointment of two bishops, and the sending of missionaries. Costa refuted the qualification of the government of Dom Pedro I as revolutionary and illegitimate, as he acted on the advice of Don Juan VI to curb revolutionary ideas and safeguard the monarchical regime and the dynasty of Braganza. On the religious side, he would be committed to fighting the evils of the age and restoring the glories of the Catholic Church in the midst of political instabilities that Brazil was going through and the possibility of the union of both kingdoms. Costa drew an idyllic panorama of a consolidated, cohesive, stable monarchy with a centralized and strong government which would drive the civilizing process. The Pope convened the Congregation for Extraordinary Ecclesiastical Affairs, which was a consultative body designed to advise on complex, delicate, and crisis political, doctrinal, and disciplinary and ecclesiastical issues. The members in plenary session were supposed to analyze the memorial and issue opinions on various political issues about Brazil. The congregation was composed of cardinals who were in favor of opening the church to the changes taking place in society. For the meeting, Giuseppe Antonio Sala, secretary of the congregation, analyzed the memorial and suggested the policies to be adopted by the Holy See. His instructions were guided by caution, wisdom, and moderation, aimed at preventing dangers and potential problems, as well as aligning institutional interests with the political positions of the European powers. He also considered the internal resistance in the Sacred College and the Roman Curia and in the dicasteries in relation to the acceptance of the independence of America and the social transformations, in addition to the projects of the Portuguese court to resist the pretensions of Brazil and vice versa, which created obstacles to negotiations. By analyzing the information in the memorial, Sala made comparisons with other documents and news about Brazil and Portugal, which allowed him to understand international geopolitical issues. He found that Costa's arguments should be viewed with reservations due to their inaccuracies and inconsistencies. Among them, the indication that everything was agreed between father and son, as well as with other European cabinets, especially that of Austria, in that negotiations were being finalized. He asserted that the Holy See's political decisions should not be based on assumptions, conjectures, and optimism, but on real and verifiable evidence, such as authentic facts and official documents. In other words, the Holy See's political and diplomatic strategies had to be articulated from a political framework that was not credible. Sala, when considering the new international order produced by the liberal revolutions and the progress of the negotiations between Portugal and Brazil, pondered that it was crucial to consider the losses and potential political and diplomatic problems that would arise with international recognition of independence and the empire by the Holy See. This is because he would favor the son over the father and provoke friction with the Catholic powers that would accuse the Holy See of recognizing governments formed in the revolution. In view of this, the Holy See should maintain the prudence it has always adopted to avoid diplomatic conflicts with allies and maintain the policy of being one of the last states to recognize the new governments. In the case in question, the Holy See would not only be committed to the King of Portugal, but also to the King of Spain, who was in the same circumstances. According to Sala, the needs of the Catholic Church in Brazil were great, but it was premature to meet the demands of Dom Pedro, first to avoid protests from the Portuguese government or the rupture of diplomatic relations. Such problems could have been avoided since it brought no advantages to the Holy See. In view of this, it was necessary to proceed with great maturity, to adopt cautious and scrupulous postures, and to weigh all the circumstances in order to reconcile political and religious interests and avoid greater evils. If the decisions were questioned by governments and society, the decorum and authority of the Holy See would be compromised. Thus, the needs of the faithful and the Catholic Church in Brazil should be met with a slight delay and no serious damage. However, if the negotiations were prolonged for a long time, and there was no reconciliation between the parties by means of a treaty, the Holy See, after verifying that these facts were authentic and official, should adopt measures to favor one of the parties to detriment of the other. That is, to separate political and religious matters as proposed by Consalvi. Interventions in the Brazilian Church would be justified in the salvation of souls, a supreme law of the Catholic Church, from which the pontiff could not exempt himself from this duty. The meeting of the Congregation for Extraordinary Ecclesiastical Affairs was held on August 22nd, 1825. Some cardinals drafted their vows to be read during the meeting. Somaglia, for example, pondered that Brazil was going through turbulence and political instability that made its future uncertain. The news coming from Spain on August 20th altered his understanding of the political aspects, since there were indications of a possible reconciliation between Portugal and Brazil, mediated by the English government and based on secret agreements between Dom Pedro I and Dom João VI, aimed at maintaining the United Kingdom. In the opinion issued by the pontiff, the members of the congregation concluded that Costa's arguments led to erroneous interpretations and the geopolitical scenarios were delicate and required caution. The reconciliation between Portugal and Brazil remained uncertain, as well as the recognition by the European courts, although there were hopes that in the future they would reach a happy result. In that case, any innovations in foreign policy would create embarrassing situations with fatal consequences. On the other hand, ignoring Pedro's request first would have relatively minor impacts, resulting in effects that are only detrimental to the Holy See. That is why it was necessary to maintain a cautious, conciliatory, and delaying diplomatic policy and to await the outcome of negotiations. If recognition did not occur in a short period of time, the interest of souls had priority, and the Pope, as supreme head of the Church and common father of all Catholics, could not do without it, since this was one of the duties of his office. Ultimately, the congregation decided that the Holy See would not provide any response to Costa, either verbal or written. If there was an insistence of an answer, the strategy was to gain time, taking time to respond and asking for qualifications, in addition to promoting debates and controversies. The far-sighted and procrastinating policy had political and institutional aims, not to compromise the Holy See and to wait for the propitious moment. They believed that the peace agreement between Brazil and Portugal would be reached within 2 or 3 months, and that the Holy See could not anticipate this indispensable consecration. At the end of 1824 and the beginning of 1825, with English mediation, negotiations between Portugal and Brazil advanced. One of the challenges Somaglia faced was the difficulty of obtaining up-to-date and reliable data on business colloquia in order to guide foreign and diplomatic policy. Being well informed enabled advantages in the negotiations, being able to contest the arguments of the Brazilian representatives, refute false or unknown news, and formulate proposals. Maglia directed Franzoni, nuncio to Portugal, to seek information from reliable sources such as Portugal's diplomatic corps, ministers, and King John VI. According to Somaglia, the lack of information prevented him from actively performing his role as Secretary of State. That is, from making decisions to guide foreign and diplomatic policies. Faced with this situation, Somaglia constantly pressed Franzoni to investigate the names of the negotiators, their intentions and objectives, as well as the terms of the agreement, the obstacles encountered, and the progress made. Franzoni, on the other hand, claimed that everything was obscure and that it was not possible to ascertain what was true, assuming that negotiations would enter into a trade treaty or promote reconciliation. He stated that things were handled with such secrecy that nothing transpires to the public. He believed, however, that the recognition of independence would not be long in coming. The Treaty of Peace, Alliance, and Friendship between Brazil and Portugal was signed in Rio de Janeiro on August 29, 1825, and was ratified by Dom João VI on November 15th. On December 8th, Vidigal received the correspondence with these documents, which were presented to Somaglia. The intention was for Somaglia to schedule an audience with the Pope so that he could present his credentials. However, Somaglia claimed that he had not received official documents from the Portuguese government and therefore could not schedule a hearing. Adopting a cautious stance, he sought Coutinho, Portugal's diplomat to the Holy See, to make sure that the news and documents presented by Vidigal were true. On December 12th, Coutinho, obeying the orders of the Portuguese government, conveyed to the entire diplomatic corps at the Holy See the news of the recognition of independence the empire by Portugal. Vidigal, on December 17th, renewed the request for Somaglia to urgently schedule the audience with the pontiff. However, Somaglia requested the issuance of a new credential since the one he was carrying had been signed before the recognition of Brazil's independence by Portugal. The demand triggered a series of conflicts, as Vidigal considered it excessive, fearing that it could delay negotiations by up to 5 to 6 months. Faced with this situation, he turned to Cardinal Bartolomeu Paca, who proposed a practical and diplomatic solution by offering to take the matter to the Pope. Somaglia's approach was guided by strategic prudence in postponing decision making in order to observe the positions that would be taken by Catholic powers such as Austria and France. He considered that the more it is seen that the horizon is cloudy, the more the representative of the Holy See must maintain as far as possible in a merely passive position and await the decisions of the other European governments. He wanted Franzoni, nuncio to Portugal, to obtain confidential information from the nuncio of Portugal.
Entre elas, se o governo português já havia nomeado um ministro plenipotenciário para o Brasil,
among which, if the Portuguese government was already appointed as Minister of Brazil about the recognition of the title of Emperor to John VI and the succession of the throne of Portugal. Franzoni, in consulting the diplomatic corps, found that Austria, England, Sweden, Denmark, Sardinia, and Switzerland had already officially conferred to Don John VI the title of Empire of Brazil. He anticipated that other countries would soon follow the suit, given the consensus among the European powers. England and Austria would extend this recognition also to Dom Pedro I. The only exception was Spain, which was reluctant to recognize it. Regarding the succession of the throne of Portugal, Franzoni considered the difficulties of keeping the two empires united and considered positive the possibility of alternating the throne of Portugal. The recognition of independence and the Brazilian Empire by the Vienna court on December 27, 1825, encouraged Leon XII and Somalia to follow the same path. On January 13, 1826, Vidigal was admitted to the presence of the pontiff. On the same day, Vidigal presented Cardinal Paca with the credential, the first letter of Dom Pedro I, giving broad powers to Vidigal, and two official letters written after the signing of the Treaty of Alliance and Peace. Subsequently, on January 12th, Vidigal attached the letter of Antônio Teles da Silva Caminha e Menezes, ambassador in Vienna, in which he recognized Vidigal as the extraordinary envoy and minister of Dom Pedro I. The documents were translated into Italian at the request of Cardinal Paca, who added a peroration in favor of the cause of Brazil. The solemn audience took place on January 23, 1826, when Leo XII received the credential of Vidigal, and by this act, the Holy See recognized the independence of Brazil and Dom Pedro I as the emperor. It was also seen the establishment of official and permanent diplomatic relations between the Holy See and Brazil. And to finish, on January 23rd, 2026, we'll celebrate the 200 years of stable bilateral relations between the Holy See and Brazil. That's what I had to say. Thank you very much. Now I'll wait for the questions. If anyone has a question to ask, you may send here that I'll be reading. We still have time to answer them.
I'm sorry for the interruption by the low battery of my device, and I was appreciating the rest of the paper and the presentation of Jérri. Very good, Jérri.
Muito obrigado, Andrea.
Thank you very much, Andrea. We've taken many months of research in Vatican, in all files, and I could collect about 3,000 documents, aside from the ones that I took, that I digitalized, and that will be the basis for a series of papers and publications for the future. I'm presenting here only the preliminary results of this research. Well, we have a question from Eduardo Martins. He is asking, what is the relation between recognition of independence by the Holy See and the traffic of people, African people, considering the Catholic Church was the big slave company to Brazil? So, well, there is no position of the Holy See regarding slavery and international traffic of slaves. At least I didn't find any document in the files I researched, and there was no moment where this issue was shown in the negotiations. Other issues that went through that was like the concern of the Holy See in not creating any conflict with the Catholic powers, and this is the great concern that we see, that is mainly to disturb the Portugal government. So regarding slave traffic, there is no point mentioned by the Holy See. Would anyone have any other questions? I think I would just like to compliment about something that is very interesting, and I would like Andrea then to talk about it, that is about the neutrality policy of the Holy See. At many moments, I mentioned this concern in terms of keeping this neutral policy, like, for example, the Holy See not signing the Holy Alliance to avoid the involvement of military interventions and wars, and also not to adhere to Glican and Josephine principles. And it also would bring the free will to guide the external politics in an independent way and in a neutral way. But by observing the external politics, we see that it was nor neutral nor impartial, but it was characterized by the search for autonomy by distance, or the non-direct participation in conflicts or international alliances. So this issue is quite clear in the military intervention in Austria, in Napoli. So the Pope Pio VII allowed the passage of the military forces, and obviously there were some demands, among which that there were no food provision or camps in pontifical cities, but he allowed them to enter in the territory of the state. Besides that, another example that characterizes it is regarding Spain, where the Holy See recognizes the constitutional regimen. However, they were searching to break the stability of this regime in many ways by disturbing the governmental authorities with the protests and mobilizing directly the episcopate against them, but without involving directly the Pope in these issues. So they were searching for an independent politics, but with autonomy by distancing. I mean, the non-participation, but indirectly, the Holy See would be involved there in these issues. Andrea, now you.
Yes, I'm sorry for this connection not so good, but I guess you were urging and stressing on the main point of about the study of this period, because restoration was an international system in which a dynamic of policy was carried out by the Pope and the pontifical state in that sense. And I find very interesting out this approach to the historiographical contest about this period with a critical view of this dialectic between Zealand and the politicans, no, as you underscore. So according to me, it's very interesting to reread, so read in a newly way the context of policies in the sense, and maybe this sample of the negotiation about the recognition of Brazil can be a kind of proof of this new approach and the dynamics of the pontifical state. So that is very good for me to appreciate your research about that.
Muito obrigado, Andrea.
Thank you very much, Andrea. I think that the pontifical of Leo X should have a rereading by the researchers. As I said in the beginning of my lecture, the greatest part of the studies are much more polemic than critical, as Ikobiak mentioned. Most of the affirmations and quoting about this pontifical lack document basis and research. It is necessary, in fact, to go to the archives and rewrite the history of this pontifical. We have a very interesting initiative, some very interesting initiatives here, like, for example, the work of Pedro de Lecura about the Hispano-American countries, when he considers that Leo XII is a carer. He doesn't understand the shades and the shades of the pontifical politics. So that's why I mentioned that we should go back to the archives, the files, and reinsure and rewrite the classic interpretations. I think it is, in fact, mandatory. And I have a question here from Rick Coelho about the kinds of consequences the Holy See would have if supporting the Brazilian independence at prompt. Well, I think it is interesting because first we defend the principle of dynastic legitimacy and the concern of preserving the balance of powers and also the neutrality in the political sphere. So the Holy See was committed to protect the European monarchies and the legitimate rights of the monarch, at the same time as they acknowledge the benefits of the Brazilian independence and of the American countries. So, for example, one of the main points of the pontificio of Leo II was to establish in Brazil the first dynasty in Brazil. Announcement would make the Holy See closer to the Hispanic and American countries. So the Holy See would not only acknowledge these independences, as they would also try to comply with the spiritual needs or religious needs of these countries and these governments. When there was this approximation, and then the Pope would even name some bishops to these countries by applying the policy of Gonçalo, in which we have this continuity between Pio VII and Leo II. So there is no rupture. And I also think it is important to mention that the Holy See was avoiding diplomatic conflict and preserve the national interests as the supremacy of the Catholic Church and the popes, as well as the maintenance of the temporal power of the pontifical states, even the ones depending on the support of Austria and the European powers. Obviously, the political guidance and diplomatic guidance of the Holy See would be based on the certainty that the Portuguese government wouldn't take long to acknowledge this independence, but it was necessary to wait. I mean, the Holy See wouldn't be able to anticipate this recognition by Portugal and other powers. So after the recognition of Austria, and Austria was even the reference to the diplomatic policy of the Holy See, so only after Austria that the Holy See also recognized it. And the same happened with the recognition of Dom Miguel I in Portugal. And I'll work that in a future paper, because the recommendation would be to recognize one day after Austria recognizes. So one day after, so wait for that. So this is the policy of the Holy See. And as they were waiting, the guidance was this: to be cautious and moderate, delaying the decision making. And these approaches would not show lack indecision or weakness, but a strategy aiming at protect the Holy See from diplomatic conflict. I also emphasize here that Somalia, as a Secretary of State, and there is a whole historiographic production in celebration of Gonçalves and Pio VII, in which we see the pontifical of Leo XII, of the one in the shade, and he as an incompetent one. And this kind of argument has no support, and it is necessary to be reviewed and revised. So the political decisions of the Holy See were based on the observation and the analysis of the positions of the government in Rio, the diplomatic negotiations between Brazil and Portugal, and also the positions of the main European powers. And there we would have the apostolic nuncios that would form the secretaries of state, and all the basis of diplomacy of the Holy See was to be informed, was to know, even to predict and anticipate to the positions of those countries and governments. So knowing and recognizing was mandatory for the Holy See to establish their diplomatic policies. I mean, external and diplomatic policies. That is, these policies are not without any calculations, and they are always guided by the advantages to be taken. Besides, they should preserve the Holy See image. And obviously, these policies would generate tension both internally and external with the Brazilian agents. So the negotiations would not have a consensus among the parties, and they had many conflicts and divergences that were substantial. But the main goal of the external and diplomatic policy of the Holy See is to survive to the age of revolutions and at the same time take some advantage of that to self-preserve and expand. It is to grow during the crisis. Besides getting back the prestige with the national states. So I think it is important to mention that all the crisis situation brought new political and diplomatic issues. I mean, what Leo the 12th and Somalia had to deal with had some permanence of the previous management, but they would also change. So they had to be adequate to this transformation, ongoing transformations with the international geopolitics and the society that would allow the Holy See to bring new responses, concepts, and projects to these challenges. So Somalia, uh, leading the Secretary of State and Leo the 12th, they knew how to face properly the urges and contingencies that are presented and formulated by the international affairs. And they also follow strictly the guidance of Somalia. I'm sorry, Gonçalves.
Sabrina Salles pergunta, né, em que medida
Sabrina Salles is asking if it is possible to prove the conservative character of Brazil's independence, if that was strategic to the Holy See to create revolutionary forces in America. Well, there's no doubt what we can see is a very conservative movement of fighting liberalism, circularization. We are always seeing a conservatory movement from modern society, but at the same time, this church is adapting in the separation between politics and religion, like Goncalves had formulated, and Leo the 12th was able to advance on those matters. He was able to advance on those matters about that separation between religion and church, while appointing emphatic bishops to Hispanic American countries, not offending popes, not offending the rights of the King of Spain, and at the same time naming those bishops. Those bishops were an assignment from the Pope. So that was another form of naming them. He established a very interesting strategy. And the diplomacy is very well thought, very well reflected. We can see the Secretariat of State, we have the extraordinary ecclesiastic work, we have reports that are demanded by the pontiff, we have meetings, we have talks, everything is very calculated. There's always a strategy that is well thought, that is well established. Everything to avoid damage. Every time they need to predict what that policy can trigger and what impacts it could have to the Holy See. In this case, waiting and not meeting the demands from Don Pedro first, it was less prejudicial than to recognize and create conflict with Portugal and European powers. Let's see if we have more questions. Do we have any questions? Andrea, would you like to say something?
I was finding out your remarks very interesting, pointing the fact that policies, domestic policies and international politics after the Napoleonic falls, in all the case, changed. So that is smart also by the pontifical decision makers to take into account that something changed, that there is not only a simply coming back, so to go to the restore the old order. So there is also kind of pragmatism to use the spaces still on the field to restore a kind of power for a pontifical state and for the pontiff in this new context in which also new nations are emerging in South America, as in the collapse of the empire in Spanish Empire in that sense, and in the negotiation in all the process about Brazilian independence. So that is very interesting to see how from the Roman Curia, from Rome, also there was smart persons and decision makers able to understand which kind of new ways were to be followed to strengthen and to restore the power and to put the Catholic and Catholicism at the center of the international politics.
Perfect. Exactly. Since we don't have any more questions here, I would really like to thank Andrea for your availability to participate in this roundtable. And I would like to thank everybody present here who joined us. And afterwards, you can send your questions, and we will be able also to answer those questions, okay? So I would like to thank everybody present here. Our international symposium schedule will keep moving forward with an extensive schedule up to Thursday. We are going to have the conference of Ailton Krenak. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Elizabeth, the translators. Thank you, Arthur,
Thank
Ivan,
you.
Wellington, the entire team from the university. Andrea, would you like to say something else?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry for my problem of connection, but I was very glad to be here with you, Jérri, with all the staff. Thanks to the interpreters and the staff of the university, and very glad to share this occasion to present the research of Jérri Marin in Rome, because I find that out very exciting and interesting. So let's talk again about that. I hope so. Also soon, also in Rome. Please, taking that into account, you are always a citizen and of Rome. So Rome and Vatican are waiting for you for a new period of research. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. So my research, like I said, was the result of my postdoctorate, where I researched in all the archives and everything that was possible for me to copy during many months. This is a hard work. It requires a lot of discipline, a lot of dedication. I was typing for 5 hours every day, and at the same time I was producing articles. So this is going to create an extensive production, and we will be able to follow up on the following years. So this research about international recognition will still be a work in progress, even more. So thank you, everybody present here. Thank you for watching us. Thank you for your kind words, Andrea. I left many friends in Rome, Caetano, Teresa, Alexia, Ana Maria, Máximo,
Aqui está uma biografia de Ana Maria.
Valério,
É conhecida pelo seu
and
trabalho
many other people that were key in performing my research. And I have the biggest satisfaction to bring these first results and to be able to contribute to the pontificate of Leo XII and also the management of Somaglia and in the Secretariat of State in that period and a context that I think is very interesting because there were so many projects, so many ideas, so many results of a changing world. The world was changing very fast, and the Holy See was also impacted by those transformations. Andrea, so can we finalize here, Andrea? Is it okay by you?
Yes, that is, and I find that so focus. That is a focus also in the changing world of today to see how at that time there was this complexity, also dynamics in the opening of new worlds and nations. So it is also a learning way for the today challenges in the globe.
Yes, exactly. And also on that context, the communications between Brazil and Rome would take up to 5 and 6 months, and communications to be connected between Portugal, Lisbon, and Rome. Those communications could take up to 2 months. So even communications would impact on external and foreign policies of the Holy See. We had many different problems, and that information network, and to visit Dom João VI, Carlota Joaquina in the ministry and talk to politicians and the diplomatic corps. Everybody had information that was transmitted to the Holy See. So that allowed us to have a policy, an external policy without mistakes, with the minimum amount of mistakes. And this is a concern of the Holy See, to have foreign affairs that have no mistakes. And if there are mistakes, we don't want to have main damages. That's it. So everybody, thank you so much. Everybody present here, thank you. I hope your students at the university can also be able to watch this conference. And I want to receive all of the contributions from Europe. Thank you so much, everybody, and we see each other in the future. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you, Jérri. Thank you to all. Bye-bye.